So this week we're talking about strength and justice. I'm pairing these two cards in the same video because unlike some of the other concepts in tarot, these aren't really arcane to us. Like, they're part of our day-to-day dialogue. We know what these words mean. We think we do anyway, and we use them, and we have a sense of them in life. So in a weird way, kind of making this video is almost not necessary. Like, we know what strength is, we know what justice is, but I actually think there's more to both of those concepts. Well, certainly justice than meets the eye. So let's get started. I was originally going to start with justice because I actually have more to say about that card, but I figured let's get strength out of the way since it's a pretty straightforward concept. Now, I think strength is strength. You know what I mean? Sometimes I hate this expression. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and kind of that's the way I feel more or less about strength. There's different kinds of strength, of course. There's emotional strength, there's physical strength. We get that. And it's funny because even weight didn't really do much to the card. It's more or less the same image on the Marseille card. It's just sort of prettied up and done in Pamela Coleman Smith style, but he didn't really add much to it. He didn't really change much. Probably because, again, it's a pretty simple, straightforward topic. What's interesting about this card, though, is that the image has not made a whole lot of sense to me over the years. Like, I get it. Like, I get the point. It's just sort of like, what an interesting way to depict strength. Although, I guess it's a better way than the ancient Italian decks, which pictured a man clubbing a lion. It's a very different kind of strength, right? But it's almost easier to understand. I guess the thing that I've read about this card a lot over the years is, there's this idea of strength that is not about brute force, that isn't just about a physical display of strength, and that the image in the Marseille and then later the Golden Dawn decks demonstrates a certain kind of strength that comes from gentleness. That comes from restraint, that comes from kindness. And I think, there's a lot of validity is probably the word that I mean there. There's a lot of validity in that idea. I don't particularly feel like I want to see a card with a man clubbing a lion, and I don't think that that is the totality of strength. So, would I change this card? I don't know. I don't know what I would put instead. There's plenty of other decks that have kind of tried to do it, and they're always interesting, but they never really show me much about that card. And again, it might just be because strength is kind of straightforward. An interesting thing about the French decks is that the French word for strength is force. So that has some interesting nuances to me, because in English we have both words. We have strength and force, because English is kind of a vacuum that has sucked up other languages over the course of its, colonial journey to us today. So force is interesting because there's a little bit more intensity to that word. I used the term brute force earlier, but even beyond that, a force of nature is an interesting thing that suggests things that are more complex than just strength, you know what I mean? But using force, use the force, all of these kinds of ways of using that word are interesting to me, and I think could bring some nuance into a reading for sure. There is sort of just a little bit more action in it. It's in a way, it's like, I was talking about this the other day, it's like strength kind of is a state, or it's almost sort of inert in a way. It just kind of is. But force is like an action. There's an energy behind it that I think is a little bit different. And this is just a word nerd thinking about the way that words work and how we can make sense of them. But like the intensity, the push in force can sort of bring up some interesting things, I would think, in a reading. Like, are you forcing it? Are you pushing the issue? And I think that that's a really interesting way, in some cases, to think about the card, especially in a situation where it's like a relationship reading. You know what I mean? If like someone asks, why isn't this relationship working out? I think a common tendency when you get the strength card would be to say, well, you need to have the strength to push through it and to make it work and to hold on and approach the situation with gentleness. But if you think about force, there's a question there. It's like, are you forcing something that isn't meant to work? Are you pushing too much? Or even if it is meant to work, are you just pushing too hard, and that's what's causing the conflict? So the idea of push or force in strength, I think, is cool. Obviously, that's not what's depicted on the card in a lot of decks, but it doesn't always matter to me, obviously. And if you've gotten this far in this series, you know that I'm just doing what I do. Now, justice is something else. Justice is a concept I think we know, and I don't think we really know it. Justice is a concept that in a lot of ways doesn't exist. And I know I say that meaning for cards doesn't exist a lot, but in this case, justice doesn't exist because it's somehow an ephemeral idea. I'm going to explore this, and of course, this is going to make the people who don't like my politics get all up in arms about it. But like, we have to understand that we grow up in the United States, certainly, with the idea that like cops are there to serve and protect, right? That the justice system is fundamentally a fair one, and that good guys don't go to jail and bad guys do. But we know that the reality of that, the reality of the justice system and the reality of policing is not that at all. It's really unfair and it's really unbalanced. And part of the problem with conflict in this country right now is that there's a lot of people who think that the justice system is fair and that the good guys win and the bad guys go to jail. And no, justice may be blind or blindfolded, but certainly isn't fair. Part of the thing is that justice is a perception. And everyone perceives it differently. Most of us are conditioned to see it in a certain kind of way, depending on where we grew up. But it's still a matter of what we're taught or what we have uncovered within ourselves as what's right and wrong. In the United States, a lot of people think that justice is the law, but what's legal is not necessarily just, and what's illegal is not always unjust. So it's really not an easy parallel, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you start taking it apart. And as I was working on my notes for this video, I started realizing this is like sort of a MC Escher drawing of an idea. Like, how do you describe what justice is? It's easier to describe what it's not. But there are some things to consider. Justice is not actually about right and wrong. It's about who has power and what they do with it. This is maybe kind of a convoluted example, and I'm not like an expert in this, but I do know the basics. It's common in the United States for illegal drugs that are commonly associated with or used by affluent people to carry less time in jail, less consequences, less fees than drugs that are associated typically or used by people of color and poor people. For example, crack and cocaine are essentially two forms of the same substance. They're just existing in different states. Cocaine, though, is more frequently associated with affluent people and celebrities, and crack is more frequently associated with people of color and poor people, people who are already at a disadvantage in the law, right? So it's like this very complicated thing where it's like the same substance and essence existing in two different forms, but affluent people are more likely to get away with using it, or if they're caught, to suffer far less severe consequences than people who use crack cocaine. Now, there are a lot of nuanced reasons why that's the case, but it is the case. So is that just, though? The justice system would say it's just because the law says this is this and that's that. But it's the same basic drug, but it's not controlled in the same way. And the consequences for people who use the different forms of it aren't the same. And that's, I would say, a good example of inequality injustice. Is it just if a mother goes to jail for stealing food to feed her child? The law would say yes. Basic humanities, to me, it says no. But again, I'm a bleeding heart liberal. And so what does all this have to do with tarot? Well, as I've said before, when you're trying to figure out what something means, it's helpful to know what it is. And so what is tarot if it's not the law, if it's not the justice system, if it's not the legal system? It's a weird idea, right? But justice is kind of a worldview. It's a set of moral values that have been deemed acceptable by a group with power, and we just accept them or not, but they have the control, and so we're bound by them. Justice doesn't really exist. It's all about context, who has the power and who's using it and how. So maybe more than any other card, and it's important for all of them, justice is really dependent on the other cards around it. If it's surrounded by cards like kings and queens, the Hierophant, the Emperor, the Empress, then maybe we're dealing with a situation where someone is using power to set boundaries or rules or control. Maybe if it's paired with like the Devil or the Hanged Man, certainly, it represents being at the mercy of a system like that, or being at the mercy of even the justice system. I mean, look, there are times where setting boundaries are good. It can keep people safe. I always say, like, there's a reason why we ID at clubs, right? We don't need young kids getting into trouble. But there are times where boundaries and gatekeeping is used to hurt people or to force a worldview on people, whether or not it's good for them. And I mean, that right there, that idea of forcing your worldview on everyone else, is essentially the heart of American conservatism. It's a big problem. It's not that you do what you need to do, it's you do what I think you should do, and you don't do what I think you should not do, because I have the power. So in a relationship reading, this card could certainly suggest someone forcing their needs, forcing their values on a partner or child or sibling or parent or boss or employee, whoever. They're exercising their power in order to control. The card also could simply suggest playing by the rules, the established rules, which, if you're doing a reading about like competitive sports or something, that's great. It can also suggest working in the system. So like if you are trying to get a promotion at work and justice comes up, it could absolutely suggest you got to be sort of a company man, you got to be like the yes man and play within the rules, play within the lines, color within the lines, right? And follow the standard pattern of how you get there. This is not a time to sort of go rogue and show you're a maverick. If you're doing a reading about like a criminal case or a lawsuit, this card plays for the system. Things are going to go by the book in terms of what the law says it is. There's not really going to be a lot of deviation from the standard rules because, again, justice in this case is representing a set of mores, a set of moral values that has been set for you. So there's not really much elasticity or leniency. Paired with the Hangman is really interesting, and it's one of the interesting things that happens when you use Waite's adjustment of putting justice at 11. Because it creates this little trio, which I find fascinating. So it creates this cool little trio, which I really like, which is justice, the hangman, and death. So you have like the law, the sentence, and then the consequence of that sentence. So in a way, it's kind of like someone getting life or even the death penalty, but like in a metaphorical way. You know what I mean? So like, here's the ruling, this is the sentence, and then it's over. And I just think it's interesting. But when it comes to the Hanged Man, and we're going to do a whole video on the Hanged Man, obviously, but paired with justice in particular, certainly there's the consequences of an action there. So a ruling has been made, and now the consequences need to be suffered. So if you're in a situation where, like, you're involved in a legal case, if you did it, there's going to be consequences for it. And that's something to think about. You know what I mean? And it doesn't even need to be legal. I mean, if, like, it's a relationship situation and you cheated and you see justice in the Hanged Man, you're like, well, there's going to be consequences for that. And actually, justice, the hangman, and death, like, there's going to be consequences for it, and the relationship's probably going to be over. So I'm going to sum up here. Justice is a weird and tricky concept to talk about, certainly in the United States, certainly given our history, and certainly the way that the legal system and justice system works today. At the same time, the whole point is, as I've said many times, not that you agree with anything I'm saying, but that you see how I take apart a concept and I try to find it in the world around us. So justice can represent systems that aren't fair, or they are boundaries that are fair. It's all going to depend on context. Sometimes it means playing by the rules. Sometimes it means that something that is legal may not be just, or the other way around. The point is that you examine the concept deeper than we've been reading about in the books and say, okay, well, what is justice? What is strength? What is the hangman? All of these things, so that when we're in a reading, we can allow ourselves to open up. So I've said that time and time again. So that's strength and justice. I'm curious to hear how you interpret these cards or how you brought them into the real world. I guarantee that my feelings about the justice card will be somewhat controversial for some folks, because I think a lot of people think about the card as balance. It comes from this sort of myth that justice is fair, and it's not. You know what I mean? And for me, it helps to look at the reality of the world when I'm reading about the world. So it's nice to think that justice is balanced and blindfolded and, fair, but that's just not the reality. And in a reading, I think we're going to need more nuance than that. So anyway, we'll see you next week. Take care, be good, and have a good weekend. By the power of Grayskull.